Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Just recently, Australia had its census, and in the running up to the census, I noticed some articles in the newspaper about the question on religion, and there were arguments presented that children should not say that they were a particular religion because the writer was arguing that they're not old enough to make a decision along that way. And it seemed just reading the tenure of the article to me that many people who are opposing the spreading of the knowledge of Christianity to people have not experienced God. They don't realise how real an experience with God is, how real God is in the world today, how much protection God provides in the world today and with his angels, and that the many bad things that are happening that are a result of human decisions to do bad things. Let me perhaps give an example of this. Just recently, I've returned from travelling with some friends through Central Australia. We did a trip through many outback towns like Inaminka and Colomulla, Birdsville. We went across the Simpson Desert from east to west on the French line and visited Alice Springs and the East Macdonald, and then came back down through the Hay River track to Birdsville, so a north-south crossing of part of the Simpson. And in these remote regions, you're very dependent on having a good vehicle and good tyres. In some places the roads are extremely rocky with sharp rocks. Other places it's soft sand. You have to lower tyre pressures right down to maybe 12 pounds per square inch. And I was travelling with, as I said, a group of friends, and we were all Christians. And so of a morning we would have worship together before we set off. After we've packed up our camp, we would gather round, have a reading from the Bible or a reading from a devotional book with some thoughts about God and God's goodness to us. And then we would pray. We would thank God for the blessings of the day, the sunshine, taking care of us in the previous days, and we would ask him to keep us safe that day and for us not to have breakdowns and for us things to go well, to be safe that day. And we would pray this every morning. Now, a number of instances occurred on our trip that I think illustrate to me how, at least from my perspective, of experiencing God. We were on one of the outback tracks driving along when in one of the vehicles the wife, the lady travelling with her husband, reached down for a drink. It was fairly warm during the day. We had to make sure we kept ourselves well hydrated. And she realised her water bottle was empty. And so she asked her husband if she could stop and go back and fill the bottle from their main container in the back of the car. So as she stopped and she hopped out the passenger side, as she walked round the back of their four-wheel drive vehicle, she heard a hissing sound. And what had happened was, in actual fact, they had just run over a piece of fencing wire in the road, and it had pierced the tyre, and the tyre was going down. But it was still quite well inflated. So because she had noticed it at that particular time, they were able to quickly get a tyre plug out and actually plug the tyre before it went down fully on the car, and actually repair the tyre. Now, if they had have continued on, unknowing that their tyre was going flat, and then travelled over these really sharp rocks, undoubtedly they would have damaged the tyre, and that would have reduced then. They were carrying a spare, of course, but in only one spare tyre, and in the outback, this could then put them at further risk. But it was interesting that just at that moment, she felt impressed to have a drink and realised her water bottle was empty, and if she hadn't have stopped and walked, they wouldn't have heard the hissing and been able to repair the tyre in time. So I see this as an example of God's protection. Let me give you another example on our trip. As we were returning, and we'd travelled down the Birdsville track and had travelled into Maree, and we're now travelling towards Melbourne. As we were coming to Bendigo, we planned to spend the night there in a caravan park, and it was getting late. We were trying to reach Bendigo from Maree, so we'd been travelling at the speed limit of 100 kilometres per hour, and I suggested that we ring up and check out where there were caravan parks. And I'm a member of a particular caravan park group and get discounts, so I suggested this one. And the lady again in this, the same lady actually in the same vehicle, looked it up on the internet as we were travelling along and said, yes, there's a particular part, and she gave me the address because I was at that stage leading the group of vehicles, and I entered the address of this caravan park in Bendigo so the GPS would take us there. As we were travelling along and it was getting later in the day, towards 5 o'clock, and we still weren't quite there, I on the two-way radio, the UHF radio, I radioed this lady and I said, maybe we should ring ahead and book because, it looks like we are going, they may, close at 6 o'clock, something like that. So she said, yes, okay, I'll do that. And she had to go back on the internet again. And as I said, we were looking up a particular franchise of caravan park, and she rang through and booked. And the thought just occurred to me, I better check that the address again. So on the UHF radio, I asked this lady what was the address of the caravan park that she had booked the sites for us. And when she checked it, it was not the original caravan park in Bendigo. Instead, she had booked a caravan park at Morang, which is some distance before we would reach Bendigo. I can't remember the exact distance, maybe 20 or 30 kilometres. So that was fine. We decided we'd stop early, and we got there and we arrived. We set up camp, and it was a lovely park. And during the night, we heard this tremendous bang. It was sort of like a gas explosion in a kitchen. And I was woken up by the bang, and I didn't hear any voices or anything, so I assumed that it was nothing significant. The next morning, our friends found that during the night, their tyre had blown out. Now, this was an unusual experience. I mean, who has heard of a tyre blowing out in a stationary vehicle? But when we examined the blown out tyre, and remember, on our way here, we'd been travelling at 100 kilometres an hour with laden vehicles, and we noticed that a large section, perhaps 100 millimetres long, of the tyre wall was severely damaged where it went in, or had been suffering damage, coming apart. And as we understand, a scientific explanation of what has happened was that about 3 o'clock in the morning was probably the minimum temperature. Now, when you're driving along in cars, the air pressure can rise 4 or 5 pounds per square inch. And so as the cool of the night, as it was dropping down to just a few degrees above zero, the pressure in the tyre had dropped down to the point that this damage to the rim, to the tyre wall near the rim, allowed it to just suddenly give way and blow out. Now, the way I look at this is that if we had have continued along the road, the extra 30 or 40 kilometres or to where we were going, that the opportunity for that tyre to blow out while travelling at that speed was very high and could have caused an accident. I interpret that the fact that the lady misbooked the caravan park and booked one earlier by mistake was God's intervention to prevent that accident happening. So that's the way I see these things, because, as I said, we pray every morning. Matter of fact, just yesterday, returning back through Sydney, driving along Pennant Hills Road, and again we have prayed in the morning for safety while travelling. Around Thornley, I was in the very left lane because I wanted to continue on to Hornsby. I saw a car ahead indicating that it was going to turn left. We're travelling at 70 kilometres an hour. But suddenly the car stopped with its tail sticking out into my lane. In other words, it didn't go round the corner. It stopped. I'm in heavy traffic, and so I put the brakes on really hard. The wheels lock up. There's a tremendous screech, but I stop just 100 millimetres short of the car. And why the car had stopped? Because around the corner there was a hearse driving into I think it's a funeral place, and there was a line of cars. And so as this car ahead of me turned around the corner, it didn't realise that there were all cars blocking the road down this side street, and then it suddenly had to stop. So I see these little things of protection as examples of God, the reality of God. Another illustration, just before going on holidays, I had our caravan serviced and the wheel bearing serviced, and we were about to leave, and I had the most overwhelming impression to check the wheel nuts, to check that they were fully tightened. Now, I've been driving for over 52 years, putting cars in for servicing, and having new tyres and new tyres put on my car. Never before had I been impressed to check my wheel nuts. On this particular occasion, I was so impressed that I took my spanner set down to my socket set down and left it by the back door so that I wouldn't forget to do that when we left first thing in the morning. And when I got out there and checked those nuts, they all needed tightening at least half to 3/4 of a turn. And so these are examples that I see of God, of the reality of God. When we pray, when we put our lives in God's care and trust Him and believe that He exists, believe that He really cares for us, these are real experiences. When travelling through the outback of Australia, particularly when we get out to the top parts of South Australia, far western Queensland, the bottom part of the Northern Territory, one of the things that impressed me is it's so flat. But every now and again you will see these mountains and the tops are absolutely flat, as if they've been cut off with a knife. And they're all the same height. You look on the horizon and there can be a row of mountains and they're all flat-topped and they're all cut off at the right height. The other thing we get impressed with, and as I've travelled through the Simpson Desert and the Great Western Desert and up the Canning Stock route on other occasions, the extensive amount of sand and weathering that has taken place. But the amount of water and the amount of force and erosion to cut all these mountains off, and over hundreds if not thousands of square miles to this level and flat, to me is very strong evidence of the global flood and the action of the global flood to erode them at that particular time. And it's interesting. One of the places we passed through was a big, what had been big sheep station, Cordello Downs. And there's a road from Inaminka called the Cordello Downs Road that runs up. And that reminded me of some evidence for the flood that was determined by the South Australian Government astronomer some years ago. His name was George F. Dodwell. He served as the South Australian Government astronomer at the Adelaide Observatory from 1909 to 1952. In 1922, Dodwell, who's quite famous, had led an important expedition to the northern part of South Australia to observe a total eclipse of the sun and thereby verify Einstein's theory that light was deflected by the sun's gravitational field. So he was quite well known. He was actually a very clever mathematician as well. In the 1930s, Dodwell became aware of a book by British Admiral Sir Algernon de Horsey, who discussed an astronomical theory related to the tilt of the Earth's axis. Now, this theory had originally been put forward by Major General Professor Alfred Drayson, who'd served as the astronomer at the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Now, Professor Grayson reported a possible extra variation in the standard slight precessional wobble of the Earth's axis of rotation, in addition to the regular wobble caused by the variation in the Earth's distance from the other planets as it rotates around the Sun. Now, this regular wobble is predicted by calculations known as Newcomb's formula. So Simon Newcomb was an American astronomer who derived that back in the 1860s or so, from memory. Now, the angle of the Earth's tilt is known as the ubiquity of the ecliptic, and it can be easily calculated when, latitude and the Sun's shadow the angle of the Sun's shadow on the longest day and the angle of the shadow on the shortest day. And from those angles, you can calculate the angle of tilt of the Earth. Now, it's interesting that the position of the Sun at those times, the angle at noon, the shadow at noon on the longest day and the shortest time, was often marked in ancient monuments. And so Dodwell realised this and went and made measurements at a number of ancient monuments around the world. In addition to that, he studied the written works of many ancient astronomers who also reported the ubiquity of the ecliptic, such as Thales back in 558 BC and Hipparchus 135 BC and so forth, right up to Middle Age astronomers such as Tycho Brahe around 1600, and of course more recent observations up to about the 1800. But the oldest observations were most important. Now, when Dodwell plotted this data, he found that the angle of the tilt of the Earth fitted a logarithmic sine curve. And so if you imagine a pendulum swinging, and you start off with a pendulum or a bob on a weight on the end of a string hanging straight down. When you pull that to one side and let it go, it will swing backwards and forwards. And if you measure that distance, it just slowly gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller till it eventually stops. And this was exactly what the data was telling Dodwell as he looked at it, that there'd been a very large deflection of the Earth's angle of tilt, and the Earth had wobbled backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, and until it essentially stopped. And he worked out that it had essentially stopped and reached equilibrium around about 1850. But when he extrapolated the mathematical data backwards, he found that there was a very large disturbance around 2345 BC. Now, the data is very greatly influenced by the data recorded on the very old dates, and his oldest data was based on measurements at the Temple of Karnak, which was built by Amenhotep I. But the date for this temple is up for question, because we know it's the dates for Egyptian history, maybe up to 400 years out, maybe even more. But essentially, what it's saying is that he calculated there was a major disturbance of the Earth's tilt about the time of the biblical flood, because his date coincides very closely with the date that we calculate from the Bible timeline and the dates given in the Bible for the date of the flood. So I think this is really, really interesting evidence that we have out there for the flood. In fact, my view is that when the major disturbances, we know the Bible describes that during the flood there were massive volcanic eruptions. And again, where you travel through Australia and other parts of the world, you can see where these lava flows have come up. They've come up through the surface of the earth. We see the massive erosion. We see the massive evidence of sedimentary deposits all over the world. And essentially the surface of the earth is covered with these sedimentary deposits that have been laid down in the past. And my thoughts are that just after the flood, as it settled up, was when something occurred on the earth that shook the earth. That's when the continents moved, pushed up the mountain ranges, and that all this occurred after the flood. And it must have been a massive disturbance to alter the tilt of the earth to that degree. And I think this, again, would fit very well some massive force that forced those mountain ranges to rise. And again, this fits with the formation of these mountains being quite recent. And when I look at the erosion of the mountains out there and the amount of material that has been eroded away, I don't see millions of years. I only see thousands of years. There's not that much material there, in my view, as I look at that. Of course, there are many other scientists that believe in creation and the flood, and we have been discussing the book In 6 Days, where 50 scientists, all with their doctorates, explain why they choose to believe in creation and reject evolution. And of course, if you want to read the texts of these particular articles, if you go to the website creation.com or Google Creation Ministries International, when you go to their main page, a search box will come up. If you enter into that search box in 6 days, the first listing that will come up in reply to that search will actually be the book In 6 Days. And if you click on that, you can click on the names of the authors. It will appear down the left-hand side and you'll see their chapters. One of those authors is a Dr. Theo Agard, and he is a former director of the medical physics at Flower Hospital Oncology Centre in Ohio. He holds a Bachelor of Science with first-class honours in physics from the University of London, a Masters in Physics from the Medical School at the University of London, and a Doctorate in Physics, PhD in Physics, from the University of Toronto. And again, he writes about how he has looked at the evidence, the claimed evidence for evolution, and has a major problem with the thermodynamic aspects required for evolutionary processes. And he actually points out that, and quotes another author, G. Tyler Miller, who wrote the book Energetics, Kinetics and Life, an Ecological Approach. Dr. Miller wrote, "We know so little about our tiny portion of the universe and observed it for such a minute period of time relative to cosmic time that extrapolating this meagre knowledge to the entire universe seems highly speculative and perhaps somewhat arrogant." Another scientist who contributed to In 6 Days was Dr. Kerr Thompson. Now, he is a former director of the US Air Force Terrestrial Sciences Laboratory. And I'm sure that they would not have a Hicks scientist in such a important position for the US Air Force. And again, he holds a Bachelor of Arts in Physics and Geology from the University of British Columbia and a Doctor of Science, which is a higher degree, in Geophysics from the Colorado School of Mines. And he served as a professor of geophysics at universities and so forth. And again, he points out, from a geophysicist point of view, the massive evidence for the flood and the importance of why evolution is absolutely impossible from a thermodynamic point of view. Another scientist that you might like to read his articles in 6 Days is John Baumgartner. And he worked in the theoretical division of the Los Alamos National Laboratories and holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Texas Tech University, a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from Princeton University, and a Master of Science and a PhD in Geophysics and Space Physics from the University of California, LA. And he has, in his article, he provides extremely powerful evidence for the global flood in recent times. I would really recommend that you read this chapter by John Baumgartner in the book In 6 Days, and read it there online, free. As I said, go into just Google creation.com or Creation Ministries International, do a search for In 6 Days, and then and click on the top one that comes up for the book, and then scroll down. And you'll see a chapter by John Baumgartner. Now, he presents highly authoritative work. His research in this area, his research has been on the geophysics of the Earth's mantle, and he provides powerful evidence for the flood, the global flood in recent times. It's a brilliant article. Well, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to Faith and Science. My name's Dr. John Ashton, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Bye for now.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.